Hey everyone, welcome back to my video blog where I talk about Azure, data services, and a little bit of personal development. Today we are going to pick up in our mini-series with part 2 where we'll discuss storage options for the modern data warehouse. So essentially in part 1 we talked about all the different tools that you can use to ingest the data and get it into Azure. And so now that we've chosen that tool, whether it be Data Factory or Databricks or one of the legacy tools that you can use on premises, whichever it is, now we have to determine where we're going to land that data. And first and foremost, the first landing spot that's going to be recommended to you is Azure Data Lake Gen 2. And we'll go through some of those reasons. But then there's also an argument to be made around landing it into a more traditional RDBMS, sort of like SQL Server or something like that, or even potentially more of a multi-master doc store like Cosmos DB. Now, we'll talk through some of these use cases where it might make sense to use one or the other. But we're going to get started with the data lake because that's probably where 80 to 90% of you are going to land your data to begin with. Okay, and when we talk about the data lake, essentially we're going to break it down into 3 main zones, which are raw, staging, and a curated zone. Now, the reason we break it down this way is that there's a tremendous amount of benefit to having all of your data land in the same place in your data lake and to be untouched. And so that's why we call it the raw zone, where it is in whatever data types or whatever storage you've decided to move it over by. You can land it into something like a Parquet format, which is generally the recommendation because it's optimized to be used with a data lake, and then all of the processing systems, as you move along the process. But there's certainly a case to be made for a lot of the other open source formats, CSVs, text, or anything like that. It kind of depends on your use case and what makes the most sense. But the first recommendation is probably going to be land that in Parquet format if you can. Now, some people will ask me what makes the most sense with regard to what they're bringing in for data. And there's a couple different approaches, but generally my recommendation is to bring as much of the data that you have up into your data lake as soon as possible. The reason for that is because more likely than not, much more likely than not, you're going to run into situations where users come back to you after 6 months of completion and say, I need this field, or we just started using this field in our source system and we need to surface that. Now, if it's something like a user-defined field in an ERP or something like that, it may not have already existed, so you may have to go back and update your ELT process. But if it's something more along the lines of a field that they didn't think they would need, or if it's something that was already there and they just weren't using it in the same way or didn't think they needed it or something like that, if that data is already landing in a data lake, that shortens the process of having to surface that data into your serving or semantic layer. So my recommendation is bring as much as you can. Storage is very inexpensive for a data lake, and you'll most likely use it later. And even if you don't use it later, you can still run broad scale analytics against that data, where the data lake is sort of that foundation for everything analytics in Azure. It gives you a great opportunity to have it all in the same place and then be able to process it from there. Including things like machine learning algorithms, AI workloads, things like that. Now, one of the other benefits of running in a data lake is that we now have fine-grained controls. So you can use role-based access controls and access control lists all the way down to the file level. Now, this is important because you could have users working on data that is only in the raw zone that'll be landed in the staging zone, but then you don't want those data engineers touching that data when it goes to the trusted zone, or maybe you're landing it in a zone for more of a data science workload, or the data has PII or other types of information that you don't want certain individuals to see. There are certainly a lot of different ways this can be structured, so it really comes down to what your environment dictates. But for the most part, we're seeing a lot of patterns where that role-based access is very important, especially when it goes down to the file level. Now, with regard to how to structure that data lake, there's a lot of great information out there. Shout out to SQL Chick, Melissa Coates, SQLchick.com, where she talks about how to set up a hierarchy for your data lake, and also pros and cons. And there's a lot of great articles that she put together. So I want to make sure she gets a lot of credit for that. But basically, when we look at the hierarchy, we've got a lot of great capability, and it depends on what your overall data warehouse is going to look like. So traditionally, I follow the Kimball method, and I start with a series of data marts. And so what I've found is that the data marts are most effective when they are in the form of maybe a subject area in the business or a line of business, perhaps. So, you think about sales or finance or those types of operations that are taking place, and then having that data in one data mart so that it's available. So that becomes your subject area, so say sales, right? And then from there, you might want to tier it so that underneath that sales data mart, you have, let's just say the source system. And then within the source system, you want to break those files down by year, and then another folder for month, and another folder for day. When you start talking about things like conformed dimensions across data marts and using dimensions from various places to surface in other areas. So you think about like customers, for instance. Customers is going to be commonly used across a lot of different data marts. So maybe that becomes more of a global folder that gets used within the hierarchy that serves up to the other data marts. So just something to kind of think about as you're going through this and understand where you want to go with it. And any structure that you put in, just make sure it's logical and that users can reference it later. So in my next video, we'll talk about sort of what tools we would use, but after you've landed the data in the raw zone, you start to do your transformation or aggregation, right? You could use something like Data Factory for this. You could use Databricks. You could use HD Insight. You could use simple stored procedures. There's a lot of options there, but essentially you have this raw zone, then you have a staging zone, and then finally you would have a curated zone or a finished zone. Kind of depends, right? I've seen up to 5 zones, depending on the customer requirements, maybe some for quality or a trusted zone where you're bringing in data at a later point in the process, things like that. But so you've got some options there, and definitely spend some time to consider what the right amount of zones would be for you. But as you're moving from zone to zone, you're doing some data aggregation or transformation or processing with one of the first-party tools in Azure. There's a lot of great capability there. Like I said, we'll talk more about that in our next video. And then with regard to other use cases that you might work in a data lake on, one that comes up frequently would be a streaming workload where you want to store that data. So that might be a completely different zone for the raw streaming data, because you could be using Stream Analytics or something like that, where you're merging some existing data and then adding some new streaming data, and it's a different path because we consider it a hot path, where we're going directly into a reporting interface with that streaming data, maybe checking against a reference set to trigger anomalies in an AI ML scenario. Just an example there. But that would be another zone probably. Typically, if you've got business analysts that are using something like Power BI data flows, you might want to have their own zone for them where they have, I oftentimes call it a playground or an ad hoc zone where they just want to be able to kind of have their own little slice of that data lake and kind of move data around as they need it. There's definitely some options there. And again, it really depends on your specific use case, but that'll make your business analyst's life a little easier if you can give them that zone. So now, after all of that data processing is done, then we're going to land that into that finish zone or serving zone or whatever you want to call it. And that's where we'll start talking about in video 4 or part 4 of this series when we start talking about the serving layer and where does that data get put back into a star or snowflake schema to then be presented out as data marts within the data warehouse for presentation. So as you can tell, there's a lot that goes into the structure of a data lake, but then I did mention that there are other considerations. So if maybe you are currently running a SQL Server on-prem, and you know that you're never going to run an IoT workload or stream in any kind of data, or your data is always going to be structured. You're not going to use unstructured data for this workload, and that's an absolute. Then maybe it makes more sense for you to stream that directly into some kind of a structured storage, right? So we have that capability where you may want